Hello, Western Civilization 105 class. Welcome to week 2. I just want to remind everybody that I always open up the next week's work on Sundays. Usually I try to do that before noon and specifically Sunday mornings. So that should never make you feel rushed. Many of you will just be getting your work in by midnight on Sunday, and you're already seeing the next week open. So that's just to help you out to get ahead or to look at your work. It's in no way, you shouldn't feel rushed or overwhelmed by that. If you're able to keep up with this week and you feel like you understand the work, what I want you to realize is this is basically how each week's going to look like. There's no surprises. I am very consistent, and for the cram course like this, your work will always be due, all of it, on Sunday by midnight. So I just want to remind that to you. And I also want to always remind all of you that the students that I see are doing the best are pacing themselves. They're starting on the work early. This class is going to be very stressful if you're always trying to get the entire week's work done in one day. And in particular on a Sunday that it's due, okay? Sometimes your work schedules just put you in that position. Ultimately, this is the situation with cram courses. Just a lot of work, and you're going to definitely want to try your best to pace things out through the week. All right. Having said that, I see a lot of you are learning from this work, so I just want to point out a few things about the information that we're covering right now. So we ended the first week talking about Ivan the Terrible. My understanding is in Russian, it's probably more accurate to call him Ivan the Formidable. The word terrible is a word that would be a negative implication in just about any culture. And imagine if you had a president and we called him the Terrible. Well, yeah, that sounds like a very negative thing. And we learned about his legacy, which was very negative. But I think Ivan the Formidable is a little bit more of a connotation. That is still kind of gangster. It's still like tough, but it's a title that would be less straightforward and negative connotation. The bottom line is, he was terrible, and his legacy, and he was understood to be a tough guy. And what I want to show you later on is we're going to develop into modern Western civilization. The way that the legacy of Russian history continues into what we're seeing even with what's going on right now in the war in Ukraine with Russia and the role of Putin. And later on, I will actually show you a right-wing Russian philosopher who actually compares Ivan the Terrible, the Formidable, Peter the Great, Stalin, Lenin, he looked, and Putin. We would think of all these leaders being very different in terms of one's maybe Christian, one's communist, and he kind of sees the Russian strongman being a part of the legacy of Russian history in a way that he considers positive, and for the rest of the Western world is seen as too much power. And so I want you to think about the debate about absolute kings, about the role of Ivan the Terrible, and also just the situation that Russia is placed within the context of Western civilization. So I want to do that in a very non-politically biased way. In other words, what I want to show is historically, I want you to see at this point the role of states within the Western world, and just for the sake of looking at what's going on and so critical in our times now, and the first real serious European conflict since World War II, which is happening right now. Look at this history and put it all together, okay? So we'll talk more and more about that later on. And feel free, you can always jump ahead, and if you contact me, we can start talking about these things earlier. but I'd like to try to help you get some understanding about all this, because right now Western civilization is in a sort of crisis, if you will, but the crisis also, it depends on who you're talking to, because a crisis can be what somebody thinks of something as opposed to what another person thinks it is. In other words, the interpretation of Western civilization, maybe we could say that is in a sort of crisis. And so now, moving into this week, we deal with revolutions. And I'm mainly going to have us focus on the French Revolution, which is one of the most important revolutions to understand in terms of a revolution that has an effect on the world. More so than I would say even than the American Revolution, which also had its own sort of inspiration and influence to this day. But then I'm also discussing, somewhat on the side, but very important, the Haitian Revolution, which is a hugely influential and revolution that most of you did not get exposed to. But I want to explain just really briefly what my approach to this is. When I have a world civilization class, I would be focusing more on the Haitian Revolution. Okay, in other words, we have U.S. history, Western Civ, and World Civ that we teach at the community college here. And my world civilization class, I try to emphasize the things that are not talked about as much in Western Civ or U.S. So I would have made this much more on the Haitian Revolution. If I had my US 101 class, I would talk more or less how the Haitian Revolution actually influenced US history. But what I'm trying to do is put, because this is Western Civ, the Haitian Revolution in context to Western Civ. And so what I also just want you to realize is that we have debates these days about is one history being taught at the expense of another history. Really, to me, all history is interconnected. The French Revolution, which is so significant to Western civilization, also becomes an inspiration to the people who are colonized by the French. This is a very interesting history, because I did Asia and the Islamic world in my studies. And you will read accounts of Algerians who are getting educated. They're colonized by the French. And they're studying the French Revolution, and they're like going, this is not a bad idea. Same with Vietnamese leaders. They're like, oh, a government that oppresses you, what should you do about it? You overthrow them. And then you have the Russian Revolution, later on we'll learn, which is a revolution, the Communist Revolution, which for many Americans we think of as something that would bring in tyranny. For a lot of people that were colonized by Western capitalist democracies, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution will inspire them for their national freedom. Maybe not individual freedoms, but for their national freedom. Very important things to understand about this. And, of course, the United States Revolution, it's probably the least revolution out of revolutions. Now, why am I saying that? Because the ruling class that ruled in the United States stayed in power. They just kicked out the foreign ruling class. In other words, it was the indigenous colonists, meaning the colonizers, remained, the establishment remained on top, and then just kicked out, the British that were far away. But for the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, it's about the leaders that are directly ruling over the people that have their heads chopped off. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a more thorough idea of a revolution. Russian Revolution would be the same. So I just want you to think about all that. So I have, as an extra credit assignment, also you can do on the Haitian Revolution, but we're mainly talking about Enlightenment and the French Revolution as the first emphasis in this class. But I really wanted to kind of draw out the importance of the Haitian Revolution as well. And so, and also just kind of talking about the slave trade that we have to deal with. Last thing I want to say on this: globally, all civilizations, I shouldn't say all, most have had slavery. And there's a big debate and question about whether or not that we are overemphasizing our role in slavery as opposed to somebody else. Some people argue and say, Americans keep acting as if we're the only ones who did this. And I would argue that that's true. We do need to keep in mind that slavery has been a global thing. What I do want to say, what's different, there's two things that are different in this, and this is all I'm going to add to this, and then I'll be done with this announcement. For many civilizations, slavery was more or less something, it wasn't the thing to do. But with sugarcane and with plantations and the way that colonial expansion went forward, you look at a place like Haiti, for example. The entire island colony was ran on the premise of black African slavery. And it was like a huge part of the political structure and the culture in a way that you can't just say it's just like, oh, it's a colony, and by the way, there was slavery, which is kind of how I would see a lot of other global slave societies. Same with the United States. The whole entire Southern economy was built on this idea that that was the major component to the economy. And it was specifically, eventually, to be African slavery only. And there's a whole set of reasons for that, which might be sort of covered in here. And you could ask me if you want to go over more detail. So that made it worse. And by the way, also, this was unique in that it made a specific skin color the target of slavery. Most of world slavery, the slaves would have looked very similar to their masters. And that's a different kind of situation as well. So instead of playing this game of what's worse and who's better, is the West worse or the other one's worse, I would like you to just pause for a moment and think about what was different. Those things are different, and those things have left a long-lasting legacy on Western civilization that has complicated kind of the way that modern Western civilization moves forward and looks at itself. Because what you see in the Enlightenment, this is the last thing I'll say, the irony is that we started pushing in Western civilization with views of an elevated humanity that probably transcended the conversation of many civilizations, even to this day, in terms of thinking about the uniqueness and of humanity and thought, and celebrating ingenuity and creativity, and then simultaneously while focusing so much on the dignity of the human, of the man specifically at the time, they started relying, the Western world, on slavery as a major economic component. So how do you justify degrading somebody to a level that you are actually saying that every human is endowed with these sort of divine, almost like powers of intellect and insight and like I said, dignity, and then you have slavery. And that kind of grotesque paradox has still kind of been, I think, the hallmark of the conflict, of the inner tensions and contradictions of Western civilization, and the United States is still kind of trying to deal with that, some sort of existential crisis, if you feel me on it. Okay, so that's all I'll say on that, and I hope you all are doing well. Watching the news is always just not encouraging, and I'm sorry that this section of history is probably not the most cheery either, but I'm hoping it at least helps clear your mind to get a better understanding of the world and why it's the way it is. And anyways, we'll be in touch, and blessings to you all.